In your first chapter, you discuss the early rise of microfinance and the ways in which it was marketed as a magic bullet for poverty alleviation. Could you please expand on how this narrative was constructed and why it became so widely accepted? What were the underlying neoliberal ideologies that allowed this narrative to thrive? I believe you write microfinance was sold as a way to lift individuals out of poverty, but it did so by positioning the poor as entrepreneurs in a system that required their participation in the market rather than challenging the structures that created their poverty.
That's right. So most people, and I've seen this in the chat, if they've heard of microfinance, they've heard of someone named Muhammad Yunus, who happens to be the current interim leader of Bangladesh. So Muhammad Yunus is a Bangladeshi economist, and he did his PhD here in the U.S. And when he returned to Bangladesh, he became increasingly known for pitching this idea that a small loan given to a poor person, and particularly a poor woman, could be used by that woman to start a business, and then the profits from that business would be used to lift her out of poverty. So it was promised as this kind of very simple, very elegant solution to poverty, in which a loan would allow a person to lift themselves up by the bootstraps, and take care of their own problems, right? Take care of their family, take care of the myriad problems they were facing in their lives as poor people. And so I go in the book in some detail about the fact that this actually wasn't Muhammad Yunus alone who was pitching this idea. There were a lot of other people at the same time who were pitching that or a similar idea. And in fact, there's a very long history of saving and lending groups that we see in places like Sierra Leone, where half of the book takes place, that have been going back for centuries. So just to say, first and foremost, that this is often pitched as Muhammad Yunus's idea, but it is a much more complicated reality there. But as you pointed out, it really kind of took off in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So I was studying international relations in the mid 2000s, and every course that I took, whether it was political science or economics, had microfinance in there as this is the solution to poverty, right? It was pitched by the UN. It's been pitched and supported by every US president from Reagan onwards. And in part because of this simplicity, this notion that, wow, this very complicated problem, intractable poverty, global inequality, can be fixed through a loan, right? And there was kind of two sides of that was so appealing. One was the fact that it was so simplistic, and the other that it's a loan, that you get the money back, right? That it's not charity, it's not a grant, that this is a way for kind of people to become self-reliant, and to become economically responsible and to be involved in the market. And so this became really popular because it appealed to all sorts of different types of people. So it appealed on what we kind of might consider the progressive side of the political spectrum. It had appeal to global feminists, for example. So the idea that these loans would be given to women was really was really appealing to global feminists who had been concerned about women being left out of other international development programs, and the idea that women were involved in small-scale informal economies that were often unseen by the World Bank, the UN, and others, right? So this was kind of tapped into that notion of a more grassroots feminist economy. And then on what we would consider the conservative right, it really tapped into this notion of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, right? So we don't need large programs, we don't need government programs, we don't need collective action. Instead, a loan will allow an individual to take care of themselves. And so there is this kind of fantastic convergence of the two on the political left and the political right, where you saw, independence leaders in places like Africa that were coming out of a long period of colonialism who said, yeah, let us take care of our own destiny, let our citizens take care of our own destiny, and this is one way to do it. And that converged with those like Reagan, who were saying, let's unleash the private sector, the forces of the market, to allow people to take care of themselves. And so that kind of converged. There was this kind of fantastic meddling of those two political ideologies that converged to allow microfinance to become as successful as it was. And Muhammad Yunus famously won the Nobel Peace Prize for coming up with this idea of microfinance and really advocating for it in 2006. And so that was kind of the heyday of microfinance. And so it was this really interesting blend, and I spent a lot of time researching that blend because it's pretty unique to see, such a wide spectrum of people agree that this one idea is the answer. But a major core of that also was the premise that this wasn't going to be a program that was going to be that expensive, or that was going to have to be included in or promoted, supported in perpetuity, right? Because these were loans, again, not charity, not grants, not state-supported programs. You could kind of, it could eventually pay for itself. And so that was really appealing as well, just from a kind of financial point of view.
Pascal, sure there's something you want to follow up?
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting about this whole subject matter is how it's the perfect confluence of neoliberal, the pinnacle of neoliberal financialization, with goodwill, charity rhetoric, and gender kind of girl power, discourse. Can you talk about how the powers that be kind of melded, how this was the perfect marketing ploy of all of these really, really noxious kind of ideas that come together to create what I would consider a financial hustle for third people in the global south?
Totally. So again, it was, as you say, it was this kind of mix of like girl power and financialization of poverty, right? And the two together, and the notion that, and we still see this in newer iterations of microfinance today, which I'm happy to talk about. Microfinance, even though we don't hear about it necessarily as much on a day-to-day basis in the way that I did when I was studying international relations in the mid 2000s, it's still very present in millions of people's lives. But it's the notion that in order for poor people to be like the rest of us, right, which is supposedly is what we want all poor people to be, they have to have access to financial tools, right? And that is that's framed as an emancipatory service, right?
Mhm.
Giving someone financial tools that you or I have, as people here in the U.S., that's considered that was kind of pitched as a sort of emancipation. So let poor people free themselves, kind of unshackle themselves. Let women unshackle themselves from traditional notions of what they should be, from the jobs that they should have. And so it tapped in, as you say, it tapped into all sorts of different ideas of what is good, right? So whether that's allowing women to determine their own destinies, or allowing the market to be unleashed in order for those destinies to be fulfilled. And so it was this thing that had something for everyone. And, when I talk to people who supported microfinance decades later, they say, oh, I guess now that I think about it, of course, if you're giving a loan to someone, you're also offering them debt, right? The flip side of a loan is debt. But it was never framed that way, right? We never talked about micro debt. It was always microfinance, and always in this very emancipatory language. And it was really hard for detractors. There were detractors from the early days of microfinance who said, hang on a minute, let's talk a little bit about the details of these loans, and just about the premise of whether lending in and of itself is really an anti-poverty program, or if it is rather a financial program, as you say. But even those detractors from the early days, it was pretty easy to kind of shoo that aside pretty quickly when the language was so emancipatory, right? When there's so much kind of excitement, and when everyone's on board, especially in a really fractious society like we have in the US, it was hard to say, to kind of even bring up any criticism, even if that criticism was asking about, is this really a premise that we should be supporting? And it's important to note that because there was so little criticism, because that criticism was quieted by this language of emancipation for so long, a lot of the details of the loans didn't come to light or become kind of more public knowledge until decades after microfinance became popular. So the loans that I found in Sierra Leone, West Africa, where half of the book takes place, the women are paying around 50-60% interest. And that's actually considered very, very low for microfinance. But those sort of rates weren't talked about as much in the early days, or if they were, it was kind of oh, well, it's unfortunate that these rates need to be so high, but it's worth it for the price of financial emancipation, for poverty alleviation, right? And so it's always, when you have that language, that's positivist language, it made it really, really hard to have more nuanced conversations.